The steady beeping of hospital monitors filled room 304 of St. Mary's Hospital, where 82-year-old Harold Mitchell sat in a worn vinyl chair beside his wife's bed. His weathered hands gently held Martha's fragile fingers, their skin telling stories of 60 years spent together under the Minnesota sun. The afternoon light filtered through half-drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the sterile white floor. Martha's gray hair, once a rich auburn that Harold had fallen in love with, lay spread across the hospital pillow. Her breathing was shallow, but her blue eyes remained as clear as the day they first met. The cancer that had spread through her body over the past 8 months was winning its battle, and both of them knew their time together was growing short. Nurse Jenkins had just finished her rounds, adjusting Martha's IV drip and checking her vital signs. She gave Harold a sympathetic smile before quietly closing the door behind her, leaving the couple alone in the familiar silence they'd grown comfortable with over their decades together. "Harold," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the medical equipment. "There's something I need to tell you." He leaned closer, his arthritis-stiffened joints protesting as he moved his chair forward. "What is it, dear?" he asked, noticing an unfamiliar urgency in her eyes. Martha turned her head slightly, looking toward the small overnight bag she'd insisted on bringing to the hospital. "In the side pocket," she said. "There's a key. Could you bring it to me?" Harold stood slowly, his bones creaking as he made his way to the bag. He found the small brass key exactly where she said it would be, wrapped in a piece of faded blue silk. In 60 years of marriage, he'd seen this key countless times but never questioned its purpose. Martha had always kept it close, and he had respected her privacy, just as she had respected his. "The wooden box," she continued, her voice growing stronger with determination. "The one in my bedside drawer at home. I need you to bring it tomorrow." Harold's heart skipped a beat. He knew the box she meant. A simple wooden container about the size of a small book, its surface smoothed by years of handling. Sometimes, late at night, he would wake to find Martha holding it, tears in her eyes as she quickly locked it and returned it to its place. "After all these years," he said softly, "you want to show me what's inside." Martha's fingers tightened around his hand with surprising strength. "I have to, Harold. Before it's too late. You deserve to know. You've always deserved to know." A tear rolled down her cheek, and Harold gently wiped it away with his thumb. The gesture was automatic, born from decades of caring for each other through joy and sorrow. But today felt different. There was a weight to Martha's words that made his stomach tighten with uncertainty. "Whatever it is," he assured her, "it doesn't matter now. We've had a good life together." Martha shook her head slightly, her eyes closing briefly as if gathering strength. "It does matter, Harold. It matters because it's shaped every day of our marriage, even though you never knew it. Tomorrow, when you bring the box, everything will change." The afternoon sun had shifted, casting deeper shadows across the room. Outside the window, leaves rustled on the old maple tree that had stood watch over countless patients in this wing of the hospital. Harold felt the weight of 60 years pressing down on him, wondering what secret could have been so significant that Martha had carried it through their entire marriage. That night, as Harold drove home alone to their farmhouse, the key felt heavy in his pocket. The same route he'd driven thousands of times seemed different somehow, each familiar landmark holding new questions. What lay inside that wooden box that was so important Martha needed to share it now, in what they both knew might be her final days. As he pulled into their gravel driveway, the house they'd shared for 6 decades loomed before him. Somewhere inside, in Martha's bedside drawer, a box held answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Tomorrow would change everything, just as Martha had said. For tonight, though, Harold sat in his car, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, holding on to these last few hours of the life he thought he'd known completely. Here's part 2 of the story in approximately 780 words, using simple English and third-person narrative. The next morning arrived with a heavy fog blanketing the Minnesota countryside. Harold stood in their bedroom, facing Martha's bedside table. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled open the drawer. The wooden box sat exactly where it had always been, its dark maple surface reflecting the soft morning light. The box felt heavier than he expected as he lifted it out. Years of dust had settled into its corners, and his fingers left clear marks on its surface. For a moment, he just stood there, holding 60 years of secrets in his weathered hands. The brass lock seemed to stare back at him, as if daring him to discover its mysteries. During his drive to the hospital, The box sat on the passenger seat where Martha usually rode. Each bump in the road made it shift slightly, the contents inside making a soft rustling sound. Harold couldn't help but glance at it repeatedly, his mind racing with possibilities of what he might find inside. When he arrived at room 304, Martha was awake and looking stronger than the day before. Dr. Peterson had just finished his morning rounds, and the breakfast tray sat untouched on the side table. As soon as she saw the box in Harold's hands, Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Lock the door," she whispered. "Please." Harold did as she asked, then settled into his chair beside her bed. The box rested in his lap while Martha's trembling fingers worked to fit the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. "Before I open this," Martha said, her voice steadier than it had been in days, "I want you to know something. Everything we've shared, our life together, our love, our memories, it's all been real. But there's been another story running alongside ours, like a shadow I could never quite escape." She lifted the lid slowly. Inside, Harold could see a stack of yellowed envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon, several photographs, and what appeared to be a military medal. Martha's hands shook as she lifted out the bundle of letters. "Do you remember James Cooper?" she asked. Harold nodded slowly. James had been 2 years ahead of them in school, a quiet boy who'd enlisted in the army right after graduation. News had come during the Korean War that he'd been killed in action. "We were told he died," Martha continued, untying the ribbon. "The whole town mourned. His parents held a memorial service. I wore black for weeks, but no one knew the real reason why." She paused, taking a deep breath. "James and I had been in love since I was 16. We kept it secret because our families wouldn't have approved." Harold's world shifted slightly on its axis as Martha pulled out the first letter. The paper was thin and delicate with age, the handwriting precise and masculine. "2 months before our wedding," Martha went on, "I received a letter. James wasn't dead. He'd been taken prisoner, then spent months recovering in a military hospital. But by then, our wedding plans were set. Both families had spent their savings. The whole town was involved. I felt trapped, Harold. I was young and scared, and I made a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life." The morning sun had burned away the fog outside, and now bright light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Harold sat very still, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. All those years, all those moments when he found Martha crying over this box, suddenly they took on new meaning. "There's more," Martha said softly, her fingers clutching the stack of letters. "This is the hardest part to tell you." She looked directly into Harold's eyes, her own filled with a mixture of guilt and determination. "James didn't stay dead to me. After I found out he was alive, we started writing to each other, and we never stopped." The hospital room seemed to grow smaller as the weight of this revelation settled between them. 60 years of marriage, and now Harold was learning that every single one of those years had contained this secret. He looked at the stack of letters in Martha's hands, realizing each envelope held pieces of his wife's heart that he'd never known existed. The silence in the hospital room stretched on as Harold stared at the letters in Martha's hands. His mind raced back through 60 years of memories, seeing them now in a different light. Every Christmas, every anniversary, every quiet Sunday morning, had she been thinking of James during those moments? "I need you to see something," Martha said, carefully selecting one letter from the middle of the stack. The paper had yellowed with age, the creases worn soft from repeated reading. "This one is from 1983, the year we lost the farm during the drought." Harold remembered that year clearly. They nearly lost everything, but somehow they'd managed to keep their home. He'd always credited Martha's strength and determination for getting them through. Now he wondered if there was more to the story. Martha's hands shook as she unfolded the letter. "Dear Martha," she read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I received your letter about the farm. Please accept the enclosed check. Call it a loan if you must, but we both know I'll never ask for repayment. I cannot bear the thought of you losing your home. Your happiness means everything to me, even if it's with him." Harold's breath caught in his throat. The mysterious check that had arrived that year, the one Martha had claimed was from a distant aunt, had saved their farm. He never questioned it, trusting his wife completely. Now, the truth of that long-ago salvation hit him like a physical blow. "James helped us?" he asked. his voice barely a whisper. Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. He did more than that over the years. When Tommy, our nephew, needed money for college, when your mother needed the expensive heart medication, James was always there, helping from the shadows. Harold stood up abruptly, needing to move. He walked to the window, looking out at the hospital parking lot below. Cars moved in and out, carrying people whose lives were also changing in this very moment, though for different reasons. His whole life, he realized, had been touched by a man he'd thought long dead. "Did you love him all this time?" Harold asked, still facing the window. He heard Martha's soft sigh behind him. "I loved you both, Harold. Differently, but truly. James was my first love, my secret heart. But you are my real life, my partner, my home. Every moment of happiness we shared was genuine. Every time I said I love you, I meant it with all my heart." Harold turned back to face his wife. In the morning light, she looked so fragile, so different from the strong young woman he'd married. Yet her eyes held the same determination he'd always admired. "There's something else you should know," Martha continued, pulling another letter from the stack. This one was newer, the paper still crisp. "James died last year. This was his final letter to me." Harold moved back to sit beside her bed, his legs feeling unsteady. Martha held out the letter, but he couldn't bring himself to take it yet. "He never married," she said softly. "Never even dated seriously. He wrote to me every month for 60 years, sharing his life, his thoughts, his dreams. But he also wrote about you, Harold. About how grateful he was that you made me happy, that you gave me a good life. He watched over us like a guardian angel, never asking for anything in return except the comfort of knowing I was well loved." The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, warming the room. Outside, birds sang their spring songs, oblivious to the revelations unfolding behind the hospital window. Harold finally reached out and took the letter from Martha's hands. "Why tell me now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Martha's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Because I'm dying, Harold, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you without knowing the whole truth. You deserve to know about the man who loved us both enough to stay in the shadows for 60 years. Harold looked down at the letter in his hands, seeing his life story rewritten in invisible ink between the lines. There was more to come, he knew. More letters, more revelations, more truth to reshape his memories. But for now, he simply held his wife's hand and waited for her to continue. Harold opened James's final letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was shaky, different from the precise script in the earlier letters, showing signs of age and illness. As he began to read, Martha closed her eyes, having memorized every word long ago. "My dearest Martha," the letter began. "By the time you receive this, I will be gone. The doctors give me weeks, maybe days. I've lived a full life, though perhaps not the one I dreamed of in our youth. But I want you to know that I've never regretted our secret correspondence, even though it meant loving you from afar." Harold paused, his throat tight. Martha reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Keep reading," she whispered. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've kept secret all these years," the letter continued. "Do you remember Sarah, your younger sister who died in the car accident in 1975? The truth is, she didn't die alone. I was in the car with her that night." Martha's grip on Harold's hand tightened. This was a revelation she hadn't expected, and her face showed shock equal to his own. "Sarah had discovered our letters," James' words continued. "She came to confront me, angry that I was still writing to her married sister. We argued as she drove, and in her distraction, she missed the curve. I survived the crash but asked the hospital to keep my presence secret. I couldn't bear to bring scandal to your family, to destroy your marriage. Sarah took our secret to her grave, and I've carried this guilt ever since." The hospital room seemed to grow smaller as the weight of this new revelation settled over them. Harold remembered that terrible night. How devastated Martha had been, how she grieved for months. He never understood why Sarah had been driving that remote road alone so late at night. Now, after 48 years, the puzzle pieces finally fit together. "There's more," Martha said softly, reaching for another letter from the box. "This one explains why James never came back to town, why he chose to stay away even after the war." But before she could begin reading, a sudden coughing fit overtook her. Harold quickly reached for the water glass, helping her take small sips until the coughing subsided. When she settled back against the pillows, her face was paler than before. "Maybe we should rest," Harold suggested, concerned by her weakened state. Martha shook her head stubbornly. "No, you need to know everything now. Time is running out, Harold. James wasn't just my first love. He was also the father of the child I lost before we were married." The revelation hit Harold like a physical blow. He remembered their wedding being moved up suddenly, remembered the tragic news of Martha's miscarriage just 2 months after they'd exchanged vows. He'd always assumed the baby had been his. "That's why my parents pushed for such a quick wedding," Martha continued, her voice growing weaker. "They knew about the pregnancy but thought you were the father. Only Sarah knew the truth. When I lost the baby, I wrote to James to tell him. That's when our letters truly began, both of us grieving for a child no one else knew was ours." Harold sat back in his chair, memories flooding his mind. The mysterious sadness that would overcome Martha every spring, around what would have been the baby's birthday. The way she'd never wanted to try for another child, claiming the loss had been too painful. "All these years," he said softly, "I thought I knew every part of you." Martha reached for his hand again. "You knew the most important parts, Harold. You knew the woman I became, the life we built together. James knew the girl I was, the dreams I had to let go. Somehow, I needed both of those parts to be whole." Outside the hospital window, clouds had begun to gather, darkening the morning light. A storm was approaching, much like the one brewing in Harold's heart as he tried to reconcile the woman he'd loved for 60 years with these new revelations. "There's still more to tell," Martha said, her voice growing fainter. "About James, about the baby, about why I finally chose you. But first, I need to rest. Will you stay with me while I sleep?" Harold nodded, still holding her hand as her eyes drifted closed. He watched her breathing even out, knowing that when she woke, more secrets would emerge from that wooden box, secrets that would forever change how he understood their life together. As the afternoon storm clouds gathered outside, Martha woke from her brief rest. Her face seemed more drawn than before, but her eyes held a fierce determination. Harold had spent her sleeping hours reading through more of James's letters, each one revealing another layer of the past he thought he'd known. "You've been reading," Martha observed, noticing the open letters spread across his lap. Harold nodded slowly. "I found the ones from 1990, about our son." Martha closed her eyes briefly, pain flickering across her face. This was the secret she dreaded sharing most of all. "Yes," she whispered. "About Michael." Michael Mitchell had been their greatest joy and deepest sorrow, a boy they'd adopted as a baby in 1965 after years of believing they couldn't have children. He'd grown into a bright, adventurous young man, only to be killed in a climbing accident at age 25, or at least, that's what Harold had always believed. "He didn't die in that climbing accident, did he?" Harold asked, though he already knew the answer from James's letters. Martha shook her head slowly. "No, Michael discovered the truth about James that year. He found my letters, just like Sarah had. But instead of being angry, he was curious. He wanted to meet his biological father." The word hung heavy in the hospital room. Harold's hands tightened on the arms of his chair as Martha continued. "The climbing accident was a cover story. Michael went to California to meet James. They spent several months together, and Michael decided to start a new life there. He's still alive, Harold. He has 3 children of his own now." Harold stood abruptly, walking to the window. The storm had broken, rain streaming down the glass, matching the tears he couldn't hold back. "Our son is alive? For 35 years, you've let me believe he was dead." "He wasn't just our son," Martha said softly. "When we adopted him, I didn't know, but James had arranged everything through his connections. Michael was his biological grandson. His daughter had given the baby up for adoption. James made sure we would be the ones to raise him." The revelation struck Harold like lightning. Michael had always looked so familiar, had mannerisms that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. Now he understood why. "Does he know?" Harold asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Does he know that his father arranged for his biological grandfather to adopt him?" Martha nodded. "That's what James told him when they met. Michael was angry at first, at all of us for the deception. But eventually he understood. He chose to stay in California, close to James, but he never stopped loving us. He's been wanting to tell you the truth for years, but I was too afraid." She reached for the wooden box again, pulling out a stack of photographs. Recent ones, showing a middle-aged man with Harold's smile and James's eyes. Pictures of 3 teenagers who shared those same features. Family gatherings Harold had never known existed. Michael's oldest daughter just graduated from college, Martha said, her voice growing weaker. She's studying medicine. James paid for her education, just like he did for so many in our family without anyone knowing. Harold took the photographs with shaking hands. 35 years of birthdays, holidays, and milestones he'd missed. A family he grieved for was alive and thriving just a few states away. There's one more thing, Martha said, pulling out a final letter. Michael is here, Harold. He's been in town since I entered the hospital. He wants to see you, to explain everything himself. He's waiting for my call, for your permission. The storm outside was gathering force, but inside room 304, time seemed to stand still. Harold looked at the photographs in his hands, his son, his grandchildren, a life he thought lost forever. Then he looked at his wife, the woman who carried these secrets for so long, seeing both the guilt and love in her tired eyes. Call him, Harold said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Call our son. Martha reached for the hospital phone with trembling fingers, while Harold sank back into his chair. In the wooden box, more letters waited to be read, more truths to be revealed. But for now, all he could think about was that somewhere in this very town, his son, their son, was waiting to come home. The minutes after Martha's phone call seemed to stretch endlessly. Harold sat by the window, watching the storm gradually clear, while Martha dozed fitfully in her hospital bed. The wooden box lay open between them, its remaining secrets waiting to be revealed. A soft knock on the door made them both start. Martha's eyes flew open, suddenly alert and anxious. Harold's heart pounded as he called out, "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Michael Mitchell stepped into the room. At 58, he was still tall and straight-backed, his hair now steel gray but still thick like Harold's had been. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand gripping the frame as if for support, his eyes moving between his parents. "Dad," he said finally, his voice cracking on the single word. Harold couldn't move, couldn't speak. 35 years of grief and loss crashed over him as he stared at the son he thought was dead. Michael crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled his father into a fierce embrace. "I'm sorry," Michael whispered, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry, Dad." Martha watched them through tears, her hands clutching the bedsheets. When the men finally separated, Michael turned to her, leaning down to kiss her forehead gently. "You should have told him years ago, Mom," he said softly. "We all should have." "There's more he needs to know," Martha said, her voice weak but determined, "about why everything happened the way it did." Michael pulled up a chair, sitting between his parents. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew an envelope, worn and creased, as if it had been carried for a long time. "This is from James. My grandfather," he said, handing it to Harold. "He wrote it before he died, explaining everything from his perspective. He wanted you to have it, Dad, when the time came." Harold opened the letter with unsteady hands, reading aloud. "Dear Harold, you don't know me, but I've known you for 60 years. I've watched you love and care for Martha and Michael, providing the life I couldn't give them. You might hate me for the deception, for the secrets, for loving your wife from afar all these years. But I need you to understand something. I arranged Michael's adoption not just to keep my grandson close, but because I knew you and Martha would be the parents he deserved. When Michael found me in 1990, I saw in him the best of both you and Martha. You raised him with values and love that I, in my shadowy existence, could never have provided. His decision to stay in California was his own choice, but the guilt of separating him from you has haunted me ever since. I'm dying now, and my final wish is for this family to heal. Michael has his own story to tell you, about his life, his children, your grandchildren. They know all about you, Harold. They've grown up hearing stories about their brave, kind grandfather who taught their father everything important in life. Forgive Martha for keeping these secrets. She did it out of love, love for you, for Michael, and yes, for me. But you were always her true north, her real life, her best choice. With respect and gratitude, James Cooper. The hospital room fell silent as Harold finished reading. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a clean, fresh afternoon light that streamed through the windows. "I have pictures," Michael said quietly, reaching for his wallet. Of your grandchildren. Emma, the oldest, she looks just like Mom. Then there's James Jr., we call him Jay, and the youngest, Harold, we named him after you, Dad. Harold took the offered photos, his vision blurring with tears. 3 young faces smiled up at him, carrying echoes of his own features, of Martha's, of the man whose letters had revealed so much. They want to meet you, Michael continued. They're all in town, waiting at my hotel. When you're ready. Martha reached out, taking Harold's hand. There's still more to tell, she said softly. About the years in between, about why Michael stayed away so long. But maybe it's time for new memories instead of old secrets. Harold looked at his wife, his son, and the photographs of grandchildren he'd never known. The wooden box still held more letters, more revelations, but suddenly the past seemed less important than the future unfolding before him. As the afternoon light began to fade, 3 young people hesitantly entered room 304. Emma, at 23, was the spitting image of Martha in her youth. 20-year-old Jay carried himself with the same quiet dignity as his grandfather James, while 17-year-old Harold, young Harry as they called him, had his father Michael's easy smile. Harold stood shakily as his grandchildren approached. Emma moved first, wrapping her arms around him without hesitation. "Grandpa," she whispered, and the simple word broke something open in Harold's heart. Martha watched from her bed, tears streaming down her face as she saw her family united for the first time. Michael stood beside her, holding her hand as Jay and young Harry took their turns embracing their grandfather. "There's something else you need to know," Michael said once everyone had settled. He pulled out an old photograph from his wallet. "This was taken the day I met James, my grandfather. But look who else is in the picture." Harold studied the faded photograph. It showed a younger Michael standing with James, but in the background, barely visible, was a familiar figure. Harold's own brother, Thomas, who had passed away 15 years ago. "Uncle Thomas knew?" Harold asked, his voice hoarse with surprise. Michael nodded slowly. "He was the one who helped arrange my meeting with James. He discovered the truth years before and had been in contact with James, helping to keep an eye on our family from a distance." Martha stirred in her bed. "Thomas was always protective of you, Harold. When he found out about James and me, about Michael's true parentage, he made a choice. Instead of exposing everything, he became our secret guardian, working with James to watch over all of us." "The money for his children's college education," Harold said slowly, remembering. "That wasn't from his investments, was it?" "No," Martha confirmed. "James provided it, just like he did for so many things over the years. Thomas was his connection to the family, his way of helping without revealing himself." Young Harry moved closer to his great-grandmother's bed. "Is that why you named me Harold?" he asked softly, "to honor both my grandfathers?" Martha reached out to touch his cheek. "Yes, dear one, because both men shaped our family in different ways, one in the light, one in the shadows, but both with love." Emma, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Mom always said there was more to our family story than we knew. She said Grandpa James used to tell her that love doesn't always follow straight lines." "No," Martha agreed, her voice growing weaker. "Sometimes it winds in circles, touching lives in unexpected ways. James loved me enough to let me go, loved Michael enough to give him to us, loved this family enough to watch over us from afar." Jay, who had his grandfather James's thoughtful expression, pulled something from his backpack, a leather-bound journal. "Grandpa James left this for you," he said, handing it to Harold. "He wrote in it every day for 60 years, recording all the things he witnessed in our family's life but could never share." Harold took the journal with trembling hands. Decades of his family's history, seen through the eyes of the man who had loved them from a distance, waited within its pages. "There's one last letter," Martha said suddenly, her voice urgent. She gestured to the wooden box. "At the very bottom, I need you all to hear it." Michael reached for the box, finding the final envelope hidden beneath all the others. The paper was new, the ink still fresh. Martha had written it just days before, knowing this moment would come. As the evening shadows lengthened outside the hospital window, 3 generations of a family brought together by love, secrets, and sacrifice gathered around Martha's bed. The last letter waited to be read, holding the final pieces of their extraordinary story. Harold looked at the faces around him, his son, his grandchildren, his dying wife, and realized that love truly didn't follow straight lines. Sometimes it took decades of secrets, hidden letters, and quiet sacrifices to bring a family full circle, back to where they belonged. Michael's hands trembled as he opened his mother's final letter. The hospital room had grown quiet, with only the soft beeping of monitors and Martha's labored breathing breaking the silence. Harold sat holding his wife's hand while their grandchildren gathered close, waiting to hear the last piece of their family's story. "My dearest family," Michael read, his voice steady despite his emotions. "If you're reading this, then all our secrets have finally come to light. Harold, my love, you've learned about James, about Michael, about the lifetime of choices that shaped our family. But there's one last truth you all need to understand. I don't regret any of it. I don't regret loving James in my youth, or the child we created. I don't regret choosing Harold and building a life with him. I don't regret protecting Michael when he discovered the truth, or allowing him to know his biological grandfather. Every choice, every secret, every letter led us to this moment, to this room, where 3 generations sit together, finally whole. Harold, you weren't just my second choice. You were my best choice. Your love gave me the strength to carry these secrets. Your kindness made our house a home. Your heart was big enough for a son who wasn't yours by blood, but was yours in every way that mattered. Michael, my beautiful boy. Watching you grow under Harold's guidance while carrying James's blood in your veins was like seeing the best of both worlds come together. Your decision to stay in California broke our hearts. It gave you the chance to know your grandfather, to build your own family, to become the bridge between 2 men who loved our family in different ways. To my grandchildren, Emma, Jay, and young Harry, you are the miracle that came from all of this. You carry the strength of Harold, the spirit of James, the kindness of Michael, and I hope, a small piece of me. Know that every secret was kept out of love, every choice made to protect the delicate balance that brought you into our lives. And James, though you'll never read these words, thank you. Thank you for loving enough to let go, for watching over us, for helping in ways we never knew until now. Your grandson carries your name proudly, and your great-grandchildren will know your story. The wooden box can be closed now. Its secrets are yours to share, to understand, to forgive. Love doesn't always follow the path we expect, but it leads us where we need to be. As Michael finished reading, Martha's grip on Harold's hand tightened slightly. Her breathing had grown more shallow, but her eyes were clear as she looked at the faces around her. "Mom," Emma whispered, moving to kiss her great-grandmother's cheek. "We love you." Martha smiled softly. "The box," she said, her voice barely audible. "Harold, it's yours now. Fill it with new memories, new letters, new love." Harold leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. 60 years, he murmured. Every moment real, every moment precious. Even with the secrets, she asked. "Especially with the secrets," he replied. "They brought us here, brought us them." He gestured to their family gathered around the bed. As the sun set outside the hospital window, casting long shadows across room 304, Martha Mitchell closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by the family her secrets had protected and preserved. In her final moments, she saw not the shadows of her past choices, but the light of their results. Harold's enduring love, Michael's forgiveness, her grandchildren's accepting hearts. The wooden box sat on the bedside table, its contents now known, its purpose fulfilled. Inside, decades of letters told a story of love that refused to follow conventional paths, of sacrifices made in silence, of a family built on choices that defied simple explanations. Later that night, as the family left the hospital together, Harold carried the box under his arm. It felt lighter somehow, unburdened of its secrets. Tomorrow, they would begin writing their own story, one of reconciliation, of newfound connections, of love that had finally found its way home. And somewhere, Harold liked to think, James Cooper was watching over them one last time, satisfied that the secrets he had helped keep had finally led to healing rather than harm, to unity rather than division, to love rather than loss. The end.